At this point, we've talked a lot about things like perspective and moving your eye around a page, and we've touched a little on lighting, but I want to dig a little deeper and talk about how lighting can change the mood of a scene and the story you're telling there. So we're going to sort of have a pretty generic panel here. I'm just going to focus on like a close-up, nothing fancy, and essentially draw the same panel twice and change the lighting just a little bit to show how you might change the mood in a scene just by how you approach the lighting and the shading. And I think I'm going to keep this fairly generic. No lighting to speak of yet, right? I'm going to go with kind of a soft lighting here. You know, maybe there's some light coming in from the window, and so you're getting a little bit sort of on his right side, but picture left. Part of the shading of figure is having a little bit of understanding of the anatomy and the plane changes on the figure. So I'm just using these kind of real basic, simple shapes for planning out where I might drop a shadow based on how the planes of the face change.
This 3D model is from Devin Corwin and is available in the Proko store, along with the new digital painting course.
So if I go in and start shading in the areas I have sort of planned for, this will start to flesh out a little bit. You get a more of a sense of a three-dimensional head here, an actual person that takes up space and has volume. It's gonna add depth to the character, but it's also gonna tell you something about, like the expression and the way it's lit is gonna tell you something about this guy, right? He seems like a pleasant enough person. You know, he's kind of got a little friendly smile, and you've kind of established your light source with the window. So if you hand this off to an inker and a colorist, they'll be able to do a pretty good job of establishing the look you want here. Now, same drawing, but I'm going to make the room darker, and I'm going to really emphasize that this is the light source and he's backlit. If you can get familiar, especially with the planes of the face, but the planes of the figure in general, you'll notice that I'm sort of following these little kind of geometric shapes. That stuff all comes from studying those planes and looking at other artists and how they figured it out. If you can break down the face to like simpler shapes like that, and it's pretty straightforward with, say you're drawing a car or a building, right? You simplify that to the basic planes of just a box, right? It's a little more nuanced with the face, obviously, but you can do a similar thing. And so all I'm doing is taking that kind of simplified head shape where, you know, the eyes are on this line, and then you have to think about the separation of the side of the head and jaw and the side of the nose with the front plane of the face, front plane of the nose, front plane of the forehead. I mean, this is a way simplified version, but this is not that different from this. Right? If I can shade this, then I can shade this. And really just try to simplify the shapes you see to their barest bones, and then you add more nuances. I mean, I had a class in art school where we had to draw the figure and really emphasized plane drawings where we just broke everything down to like the most basic three-dimensional form. And then the professor would come in and say, all right, add more in terms of more facets, add more depth and more detail to the model. And that was hugely instructive for me, right? Because you can start with basic three-dimensional form and keep adding more and more and more until you get a really, you know, it's stylized, but you end up with a pretty interesting drawing, and you learn a lot about the planes that you're observing, just as if you were carving it out of a block of some hard material. But getting back to the lighting, same drawing, totally different story. Like maybe you walk into this room and you say, hey, what's up, fella? Maybe you walk into this room and you slowly back out, right? Like the drawing hasn't changed. It's just how I lit the figure and what I decided the light sources were. And even that, I didn't change the light source dramatically. I just emphasized how important it is to the scene. So on top of all the other tools we've talked about with cinematography, the shots and being familiar with all the sort of standards and using the horizon line and perspective, all that stuff's important.
And if you want to see all those lessons and improve your perspective and cinematography, you can find them at proko.com/marvel.
But this is where you're going to sell the scene, right? You're going to start adding the details, adding the lighting, adding the shadows. And this is when the story will finally be sort of told in its entirety. You can see just from this really simple demo that I'm using all the tools we talked about, but even if I didn't have those tools and I did kind of a, smiley face guy with almost no three-dimensional features on it, I could still create the same story, right? I could do a smiley face guy like that and then one like that, and they have a totally different feel to them, just the lighting. So if you take out all the drawing skills we've sort of been obsessively covering because, it's such an important part of the job, you can still tell story with very, very, very basic drawings and just a mindful approach to the lighting. And I think what it is you can't help but respond to the contrast of black and white. So I try to be mindful of, there's got to be a fair amount of black. Now, I don't do half and half. I could still add more black here, but the more I add, subconsciously, you're going to think, oh, it's later in the day. I mean, if I was to go in and add kind of a cast shadow here, you're thinking, oh, the sun's probably setting. There's some cast shadows going on in the room. Maybe shoot for 15 to 25% black, even if it's a daytime scene, so that you have some depth and some dimension to whatever it is you're drawing. This is way more than that. This is maybe 75%, right? But that's because that scene calls for that. So I don't want to say there is a rule, you got to do this or you got to do that. Because frankly, you could do an open line style across the board and just color it so that it feels like it's night or day as part of the drawing. You can make something that's very, very dark and happy or warm or making someone feel like they're in a cozy space. So it doesn't have to be just across the board, dark means bad. That's where the drawing comes in. Like I purposely left this blank so that how I lit it would change how you felt about the character. But I could have drawn this in a different way where maybe he's standing in front of the window and you just see a silhouette and maybe he's holding a cup of coffee and he's looking out at a cloudy day. I kind of go with my gut and my eye and I decide if this scene is meant to be spooky, how can I light it so that it feels spooky? Instinctively, we know the less you show of a thing, the more scary it is, right? The more I see of the monster, the less I'm kind of, intimidated by it. So you kind of use some of those instincts in how you're going to approach the lighting and tell your story. Okay, so essentially same scene. The first step is to decide where is the character, and the lighting is going to be dictated by that. So let's say scene's outside, maybe it's a pretty sunny day, but the sun's lower in the sky. We're gonna have some pretty deep shadows still. Let's say the sun's up here. Naturally, if it's sort of behind her, you're gonna get some pretty harsh shadows sort of along this line. And I'm just sort of blocking in rough planes of the figure, knowing that this essentially would all be kind of in shadow. Now, that's a lot of shadow for a scene that doesn't need to be that dark in terms of its mood. I could do a couple things. Number one, I could just omit it and take it out and say, this is a scene where she's on the sun, yes, and it's harsh lighting, but I don't want that to carry over onto her face because it obscures her face and the scene doesn't really call for that. So I can kind of hint at the shadow being a little heavier without going all in on it. Maybe she's got a darker sweater and that's less important to the face. I could go darker on the sweater, easier on the face. Now, this maybe gives the colorist a guide to make this the far side of the face a little darker so that we still get a sense of that harsher sun, like low setting sun cast shadow on her face without darkening her face so much that it makes the mood of the scene darker than it needs to be. Now we're outside. Again, she's maybe in an environment that's not super safe. Let's say she's walking down a dark alley and I want to create some suspense, right? So maybe what I'm going to do is imagine that there's a light source. It could be directly above her or it could be to one end. Let's say it's over here. And so that's casting a pretty harsh shadow on a good part of her face. But because I want her to feel a little like she's in a not so safe space, I'm okay with obscuring more of her face here. Right? Because she's walking down the dark alley and it's not a big change, but it definitely says that I want her face to be more open for this scene up here, less open down here. I might emphasize the eyes and the darkness to sort of show that she's a little nervous and looking over to the side and keeping an eye out for any potential threats, right? But it's unnatural lighting, so there tends to be more than one light source. So maybe there's another one coming from this direction. Maybe it's a little lower. So this one is, maybe up here. This one's a little lower and maybe closer to us than this light is. And it's hitting her at this direction. Well, that gives me the opportunity to add a little bit of like a rim light to the back of her. So I'm now both fulfilling that pragmatic reason for the lighting. Where is she physically? How is that lighting dictated by the space she's in, and how can I do it in a believable way? And what can I do to emphasize the mood of the scene? Same drawing essentially. I haven't even drawn a background, so we've done tons of backgrounds. I want to just do this with nothing but light. But you get a sense of where she is just from that, and a little bit of a mood. So I've put the composition so she's essentially right in the center. And so as a reader, you're looking at this head on. So what part of her is facing you the most directly? It's her shadow area. It's the part you can't see, the part you can't know. So by having this shadow closest to the reader facing you, the reader's going to instinctively say, I don't know what the heck's going on here. Is she in some danger? Why is the place she's in so dark? She's somewhere where the lighting is not natural. She's not getting a natural effect on her face from whatever environment she's in. And just that, no background, is enough to give some information to the reader. Now, you couple that with, maybe I'd put a little bit of a sun, make it kind of a basic outline. Okay, she's out in the field somewhere. Maybe I drop in a brick pattern. Nothing crazy, just enough to get the information across. Maybe there's some graffiti in the background, right? We're getting a sense like, oh man, maybe she's walking down some spooky alley. But you didn't need all that background information just yet to get a sense of that. You can have the lighting do a lot of the heavy lifting on the figure itself and tell that part of the story. And that's just going to get emphasized even more when you start adding in the background details, using all the tools we talked about before: perspective, horizon line, camera angles, all that stuff. But this is really where you're going to sell the scene, right? You're going to use the lighting on the figure, on the environment to really sell. I mean, I might take it farther and add, some shadow to the background to imply where the light source is up here, knowing that it's going to get darker as I go down to this corner where it's the farthest from the light sources. Remember, we have this light source, but it's closer to us. So I might take it a step farther, and maybe this light source, because we have multiple light sources, is actually casting a shadow from her onto the wall. So now I really hemmed her in with shadows, right? Because now she's got a shadow on the light side of her face, creating a higher contrast. And so you have that nice high contrast on the figure, and it makes her feel that much more trapped in by these shadows. So you can maybe make this, add some hatching here so that it's not a harsh black and it slowly gets darker. And then maybe you keep this line a little harder. And so now you've really surrounded her by lots of dark shadows versus here where she's wide open, right? You get a sense here because she can turn around and run off to the horizon. In this scene, there's not anywhere to go. So let's say she's holding a flashlight. So we can create kind of a beam of light, and we don't have to necessarily draw the beam. We could just omit the shadows in that beam's trajectory. But I've now added another light source. And so you're going to get a little bit of rim light underneath the jawline, under the nose, right? So now you're going to get a tad bit of that kind of classic horror underlighting in addition to the lighting coming from other places. So third light source, flashlight, it just added to the spooky element. But we've also added an element to the story because now she's got a flashlight, so she has a little bit of a say in what's happening in the scene. It's not just her walking down a spooky alley. She clearly came prepared. So that says something totally different about the character. But by doing that, it's almost amplified the threat on her, right? She's even more lit in this spooky way because now we know she's looking for trouble in this dark alley versus having just stumbled upon it. So all that stuff comes into play, and you just have to plan ahead, work it all out, make sure that it makes sense. I'm not obsessing about every little shadow. I'm going to try to still simplify it so that the three light sources make sense without putting so much on the face that we lose a sense of who the character is. But you can still make it work. We're in art school and everybody's seen the exercise where you have to shade the ball and you say the light source is here, so I got to put the shadows on this side. Well, that then casts the shadow this way. But then any art teacher worth their salt probably said to you, well, is the table reflecting light up? So you need a little bit of a highlight here because the table is, even though this is in shadow, it's still getting some light and it's going to reflect it up on the orb. So to most kids, you ask them to draw a ball and shade it, they think it's silly, right? Because they're saying, I'm not here to draw a ball. I want to draw Spider-Man or Wolverine. But it's not that big a leap from that to this. in this case, if I were going to really take this all the way, I would be going in and adding a little bit of a cast shadow to the bricks, because whatever's lighting her harshly is going to affect these bricks. Even though they're, stacked on each other on a flat wall, there's still some three-dimensional element to them. So everything is in play once you decide on the lighting, and everything has to match. You can't shade a character a certain way and then ignore everything else. Now you can do that in like a grand design sense. The previous example, I think I just left the shirt white, even though everything else was black around it, because design-wise, it worked within that scene. And again, we always have artistic license, so you can bend the rules a little bit, but it has to be within reason. You want to keep everything in the environment consistent with what's going on with the character itself. That goes to the horizon line and the perspective, but it goes to the lighting also. We're telling stories here, so you can play with some of the rules and do some artificial lighting that just still sells, right? As long as it sells to the reader, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. As long as the scene is coming across in the way that the writer intended, in the way that the editors like to have the story fit into that scene fit into the grander story, then you're good. Like the more stuff I put in here, the more I'd have to account for the lighting. So let's say there's a pipe coming out of the wall. So I have to now shade that thing in a way that matches this. So I know I got a light source. It's coming here, right? So this is probably all in shadow because that's the plane that's facing me, just much like the plane on her face that's facing me. And I know this is probably gonna all be in shadow because this light source is coming down at it at an angle. Maybe it's a little less. But I have this one that's facing it straight on too. I have to kind of account for that. I might even have a highlight straight down the middle with this little rim light here caused by that light over there. Every time you add something to your element, it goes back to this or the box thing, right? Like if I'm lighting a box and I know light source is over here, so this is dark, this is light. Well, if I add another light source, well, then I got to figure out a way to make the top of the box closer to the light source a little lighter and this corner darker and things like that. You're doing that here just with a lot more elements in the scene. Every artist is going to approach this differently. You're going to have an artist that will just take this and ink it in a blocky, straightforward way. You're going to have an artist that will maybe take this and add all kinds of hatching and rendering. There's no real rule for that. That's one of those things where that's where the genius of the individual artist kicks in. What is it that makes that song sound so amazing when that particular person does it, even though it's a standard and 100 other people have sung it? So I would leave this to the inker or whoever the artist is to decide, what do I do next here? Me, I'd probably add a level of hatching to certain things. But again, it's all extra, right? It really is just, this is the foundation. Everything after this is where the artist's individual voice kicks in.
You'll make better art if you practice these concepts. Go to Proko.com/Marvel to get the assignment and to submit your work for possible critique. The deadline is soon, so go check it out now.